Like, to be honest, with half of the apps that are discussed that we should, deal with, and we're like, guys, they're gonna die in a half a year anyways. It's like they were like, you should really do something about Google Glasses, and I was like,
thoughts on the Hamburg DPA's opinion on
I don't know what they drank or took, or I don't know.
So
I'm very worried about the DPA is getting into this AI stuff too quickly. The Court of Justice became a constitutional court, kind of a Supreme Court of the European Union. Before that, it was more of a commercial court, you could say, or like an international court, so to say.
What would be table stakes for you in terms of something that is passable?
So what's interesting is that, first of all, what would be super easy to fix is the commercial surveillance, like the commercial data processing side, because you would just have to update the safe harbor principles. And that is, from a European perspective, there's no reason in the US law not to do that. It's just business interest is not there. And from a European perspective, very simple, you just copy over the text from the GDPR and say, this is now a self, declarative system where it's kind of civil law and not a GDPR type of thing. So that would be the commercial part. On the government surveillance side, the issue is really not the level of surveillance, because we actually agree on both sides of the Atlantic on kind of having protections against the government. So other than the commercial side, we actually have very little disagreement on the level of privacy. The problem is who is covered. Under the Fourth Amendment, just US citizens or permanent residents. Under the European approach, we have human rights that apply to everybody. So if you're, from Africa and you live in Berlin, you basically have the same rights as any German. And these approaches are really the problem. So I think what we need in that area as a fundamental principle among democratic countries is a mutual recognition of having these fundamental rights, because your data is always going to go abroad somewhere. And I think US gets that gradually because of the Chinese situation, to say, okay, with Huawei, our data suddenly goes to China. With TikTok, our data may go to China. And now, being on the receiving end, suddenly the US cares about data transfers if it goes out, if it goes in, not so much. So I think there may be more common ground on that in like talking about a decade or two, maybe. When there's a political opportunity, when people got together, that we have a, let's say, common framework and mutual recognition of privacy rights. The last bit, which is a bit more complicated, is also the judicial approval. But if you think about it like that, for the number of targeting for the amount of targeting we have in the US, you probably have to employ, 20 or 30 judges. Like, I can tell you, in Austria, we have what we call a journal judge, like one that is also there 24 hours overnight. And if they have a really quick thing, someone calls them and basically orally explains the case, and that person says yes or no.
Wow.
Just because you need to kind of, go into this house now, and you don't have time for like a lengthy process. And you have to process thereafter. So there are systems like that. And if you put like 20 or 30 judges in DC to just approve NSA surveillance or not, this would be so much cheaper than all the compliance circus we have of the last years. Like, it's so much more efficient. You would have better privacy protection, better oversight, all of that, and way less cost than the whole craziness that we did the last couple of years.
Well, governments aren't typically efficient.
Yeah, so the big problem that you get in DC is not that they're not efficient or that they have a problem about being efficient, but that there is no way you get anything passed in US Congress anymore. That
we're seeing that with APRA right now.
Yeah, and if it's one of the people in DC told me, there is no way I get, like, if I do something for the rights of foreigners, I'd rather get voted out than voted in. So unless the US industry is going to get behind this and say, actually, we're not interested in spying on our own customers, which is true, like they have that. And we're going to get behind some reform where we say, okay, there is going to be somewhat rights for foreigners too. There is somewhat of an overview system that is before surveillance, which is not ex post, but before. This would all be steps that would be very cheap, very simple to do, and could get done. The problem is we need a pressure group in the US to actually get that done. And if you talk to the big tech companies, the answer you get is, oh, we have limited political capital, and we'd rather invest it into like lowering taxes or something else we're interested in than in this. So I think that's the only way that the dominoes could fall. That there's enough pressure on the European end that then US industry says we have a problem. That basically puts pressure on the political system in the US, and then you could alternate it. And there are alternatives that are quite simple. I mean, just asking a judge before you spy on someone's private messages. is not too much to ask for, especially from the US. The thing comes up that we're all partners and we love each other, and they absolutely don't understand that criticism. If there's so much love and partnership, why not have a judge approve this?
Yeah, highly politicized topic.
Absolutely.
I don't think we're going to get a solution that's going to hit on your table stakes anytime soon, but hopefully. I wanted to switch gears to Pay-OK. I'm hitting on all the stuff. I'm hitting on all the great initiatives that you're spearheading, Max. But so, Pay-OK, which is the sense that, if you're going to be using a service like
the reject button fee.
Yeah, exactly. Making essentially consumers pay for the non-use of their information for targeted advertising. What are your thoughts on companies that kind of push back on that concept? Consumers have a choice. They can use our platform. They can not use our platform. How does that resonate with you? Because there is, essentially, I do have a choice not to use Instagram.
It's the accept it or f off choice.
Exactly. Which is that a choice at all? Right?
Yeah, we interestingly, and Pay-OK is kind of blowing my mind in the sense that everybody totally loses their principle we have anywhere else in this discussion once this payment option came in. Historically, the problem is that the first ones that did it were newspapers. Actually, the liberal newspaper in Vienna was the first one that came up with that idea. And then the Austrian DPA kind of accepted it, and then gradually it kind of grew into Germany and France, and it's now in a couple of jurisdictions in Europe. There's a couple of problems with that. So first of all, the whole idea of freely giving consent is that it should be the genuine choice of what people really want. And you can statistically figure that out. You can ask people, do you want to be tracked for advertisement? Now, if people did that, it was usually between 3 and 10%, depending on how the question was asked and time and study and so on. But somewhere in that ballpark, let's take the 10% as the higher end. Actually want to get tracked online. And then for Pay-OK, we know that we get a 99.9% consent rate. I usually call it the North Korean consent rate because, it's so obnoxious. That, and now the interesting part is this is one type of a dark pattern, one type of pushing people to consent. And what's really interesting is the DPAs agree that having a reject button on the second layer or not in the same color or whatever is so deceptive you could not possibly do that. But putting a 10 euro fee on the reject button, absolutely fine, no problem. And the only reason for this intellectual disconnect, to pull it mildly, is that the media companies did it first. And none of the regulators actually wanted to do something about media companies. And it's really interesting also when we bring cases, like whenever the case is against the media companies, suddenly no fines, no consequences, nothing, because they're absolutely terrified to go after them. And the problem is that GDPR doesn't have any kind of media privilege in that sense for advertisement. So it's interesting because basically they shoehorned this in. And now the DPAs have a tough time to tell anybody else they can do it because what would be the legal basis to do so? And now we see with the EDBB paper, Meta obviously took it. I mean, when we had these discussions in Austria, I told the decision makers, you think you're smart now, but in a year or two, if that's accepted, Meta and Google, everybody is going to do it. Fast forward 2 or 3 years, there you are. And the interesting part is now they try to kind of rein in Meta to somehow say, for example, because you have a network effect as Meta, you cannot do Pay-OK. Now, there is zero evidence that the network effect would change behaviors of people. Like we know that for some shitty website that you visit once in your life, you still have a 99.9% consent rate. It's not that Meta will have more than that. Maybe they have a 99.99999. But this political difference that they try to make because they just don't want Meta to do it, but the media companies, they now have a whole paper with totally made up reasons why Meta cannot do it. And my worry is once this hits the Court of Justice and Meta has somehow reasonable lawyers, which, to be honest, is sometimes not really true, but if this time they have reasonable lawyers, they will make that point and say, how should that be legal for us? These points are not scientifically proven. There's no evidence that that's a difference than a newspaper. And then the problem could be that that the EDPB has a hard time explaining that. So we think that there is no way to have Pay-OK in any reasonable approach.
Okay.
And that is on the legal side. Now, the bigger issue, or the argument that oftentimes comes up, is the economic argument you made before. And that's also such a fucking lie. We know that this newspaper that started it makes about 4 cents per user per month. But the fee is €9.90. So you overcharge about 200-fold. So even if you make that economic argument of, oh, we need it because otherwise we're going to go down. If a cell phone company does the same thing, they would have to say, yeah, like normal cell phone we being spied on is $990, and then not wanting to be spied on is 200-fold that, so €2,000 a month. So if you compare that, it's so absurd. Or we did the calculations of if Meta, basically one app, charged I think 200 something per year. We then extrapolated, and it's like if you have a family of 4, it would be €35,000 for the average number of apps on a phone. So for phones, I think 32 apps is the average that people have installed.
It's crazy.
It would be €35,000 to just say no. That's higher than the average income in the European Union. So one of the two parents would have to work only for opt-out, and the other one for the food, so to say. I don't know how to do rents then, but just if you put that, just very simple calculations.
Right.
First of all, it gets the lawyers on the other side totally outraged because it's so obvious that it's bullshit. But I think it's also showing how this narrative of, oh, we need that for economic reasons is just stupid. And if you talk to the media, it's interesting that they also actually tell you that they don't make much money with the Google ads and the ads where they need consent for. They usually say, at least the bigger newspapers, that they make most of the money still with directly paid ads, where basically a customer comes up and say, we want to have a huge, ad all over the front page that is usually very customized. It's not on any kind of big platform that this is exchanged. And one of the media people we had on a panel that we organized said it's basically like an airplane. You have first class, which is kind of this kind of type of deals where I really make the big bucks and the real money. Then we have kind of second, like a business class, so to say, to stay in the airline picture, where they have joint consortiums with direct payment and so on. But that's all still not kind of where you really need personal data for. And then they basically said for the rest of the pages, like basically where there wouldn't be any advertisement because we just don't have that much inventory, that's where we have Google ads. So that's kind of the economy just to fill the back of the plane, so to say. And that is where we actually need the consent for. So also this argument of you need advertisement as the only way of revenue is just crazy. They still make most money with subscriptions, with premium products, with all that kind of freemium approach and so on. And that is what I get really pissed about in the pay or okay debate is everybody has a view on it, but no one has the evidence, the numbers behind it to say, okay, where's the money really coming from? What was really taken away from you?
Do we have numbers yet in terms of who's actually subscribing to Meta's?
No, on Meta not. We know it for the newspapers. Okay. And I think my guess would be for newspapers, people would rather pay for it because there is this value exchange that you actually get content. Because one big lie also on all the social media is they don't give you content. Like the dying squirrel that someone takes a picture of and people like is actually by some other user. Like Meta has never done anything for this. So the big difference for these platforms is they're a pure hosting provider in reality. This costs almost nothing. That's a couple of cents per user. And it's interesting because if you look at the revenue that they're making from advertisement, it's totally different ballgame. So some people also make this comparison that basically pay or okay should be as much as the service costs or the revenue from advertisement is. But that would basically mean that a newspaper can charge 4 cents, 2 cents a month. But actually Facebook can charge €5 a month. So it would actually incentivize the big tech companies to be able to use pay or okay and the small ones not. So that can also not really be the answer.
Right.
And I think this is the big problem, that no one dares to dive into this, actually do proper studies, ask, for example, what are the elements why people are in the 99%? Because I think money is maybe not even the biggest factor. Like some people probably not care about paying the $5.
Right.
But for example, opening it up, typing in your credit card, going through the whole checkout process, approving the payment with your app on the phone, all that kind of stuff, just for reading one article.
It's a lot of friction.
That friction may be the bigger thing than the actual amount, And the friction to click an OK button is basically zero. So all of that, there is no evidence, there is no research. And nevertheless, just like with the AI example before, some of the regulators feel absolutely equipped to make wonderful decisions around that. And that's a problem because it's, really decision-making without having the proper facts on it.
Okay. Last question for you, Max. Might be a little bit of a controversial one, but from your perspective, obviously you are an advocate of privacy, bringing these types of, litigation and complaints and whatnot. Anybody out there that's doing it right? Anybody out there that you're like, kudos to you for,
There is where we usually see quite positive results is in areas that are traditionally used to compliance and used to privacy like that. So for example, the only
Banking.
subject access request that I ever had that was perfectly answered, not in 1 month, but really in like as quickly as possible, was, for example, from my telco provider, because they're used to, that. Usually that's exactly banking, telco, and so on, where you see that, first of all, they employ people that probably also give them the right answer and not just any answer.
Okay.
Invest enough in it and have a company culture where that is a thing. And I think that company culture part is oftentimes the biggest element. And I think that's more for everybody else probably that listens on what is really driving privacy within a company. We just did a while ago, or like 6 months ago, we asked 1,000 data protection officers, how do you convince your CEO to do anything? and it was really interesting to get the answers, because number one was, for example, fines and cost. Number two was reputation. So that's the two things. And then, for example, the EDPB is always very proud to put out more and more guidelines. And the companies are asking for more guidelines because it's also confusing, and we need more guidelines to get guidance, because we're also like, we have no clue. Guidelines was rock bottom in anything influencing. It's like, no one reads these guidelines or no one follows them.
They're not enforceable,
exactly.
Right?
So it's really interesting that we also, when we come to these discussions, need evidence. It's really a bubble that is deprived of evidence when it comes to enforcement and so on. And I talk to regulators, and they're oftentimes, having positive examples is the best thing. Like the positive examples, no one follows that. And one of the big things is really fines that are also paid, because one big part is like a lot of these Irish fines are never paid. None of them were paid yet. So we really, they're all stuck in litigation. One of the cases, like actually the data transfer one, as far as I've heard, I don't know if it's accurate, put a big asterisk on this, is that they now settled the case to just have it lapse or like sit in court forever and be paused forever. So you have a fine that is just never going to be collected in reality. And that's now the next way how the Irish DPC makes sure that if you invested in Ireland, even if the EDBB forces you to issue a fine, which they didn't want to issue in the first place, then they put out a press release and it's like, we're the toughest enforcers, big fine, which actually the EDPB was like with their gun in the back to say, do this. And then when it actually goes to court, it never gets collected. So there's a lot of this going on. And I think that is the problems we have, and where we need to mature this whole space, because it's still a nice to have, do a little bit of window dressing bubble to a large extent. And where we need to move towards like, okay, this is the law and this is it. And that's also for us really interesting, because you're called this kind of, privacy activist or something. And the super activistic thing we do is reading the law. And in our bubble, that's already quite a bold thing to do. And I think that is where a lot of the stuff needs to move forward a bit.
Max, so incredibly elucidating. I learned a lot from you, but thank you so much for your time. Thank you for watching this episode of Transcend Field Trips. I'm Ron De Jesus. See you out in the field.